All right, let's dive into a really fascinating puzzle from religious history. We're going to talk about how a modern prophet ended up being accepted by a church that was founded on one core idea, the Bible and the Bible alone.
Yeah, it really all comes down to this one major conflict. See, on one hand, you've got this group that's all about sola scriptura, that Latin phrase that means the Bible is the only authority, period. But then, on the other hand, they start accepting these ongoing visions from a modern prophet, Ellen G. White. So how do you make those two things work together? How do you square that circle? That's the story we're going to unpack today.
So to really get how this happened, we've got to travel back in time to 1844. Now, I want you to just imagine this. Thousands of people, they've sold their farms, they've quit their jobs, they've gathered together on hilltops because they are absolutely certain that Jesus is coming back on October 22nd. And then the sun rises on October 23rd, and they are just crushed. This huge crisis of faith, which became known as the Great Disappointment, well, it created this massive vacuum, a space where new ideas and, frankly, new sources of hope could rush in.
And right into that chaos, just a few weeks later, this young woman, Ellen Harmon, starts having visions. And this is what really kicks off the first phase of how she was accepted. And it's important to know, this wasn't about some deep theological debate at first. No, it was all about practical results.
So this whole crisis, it created a really important split. The main Millerite leadership, they just doubled down. They officially rejected any and all new visions, calling it all fanaticism. But a smaller group decided to take a different path. These were the folks who would become the early Sabbath-keeping Adventists. And what set them apart was their belief in observing the seventh-day Sabbath. And instead of just rejecting these new visions out of hand, they decided, okay, let's put them to the test.
And their tests were super practical. They weren't complicated. They were basically asking three things. First, and this was the big one, does this vision contradict the Bible? Second, what's the effect? Is it producing good fruits? Is it bringing together these scattered, heartbroken believers? Is it helping to fight back against all the wild fanaticism that was popping up everywhere? And third, can we tell if this is real, or is it just another one of the many counterfeits out there?
And look, this was not some kind of blind acceptance. Not at all. Let's take Joseph Bates, for example. He was one of the key founders. This guy was a tough, retired sea captain, and he was skeptical. Really skeptical. He even called himself a doubting Thomas, saying flat out he didn't believe in visions. He actually grilled Ellen Harmon, cross-examining her like he was trying to break a witness, because he was determined to get to the bottom of it.
So what could possibly change the mind of a guy like that? Well, it was a vision she had in 1846. In it, she described some really specific details about the planets, stuff that Bates, being an old sea captain with a love for astronomy, knew there was no way she could know on her own. For him, that was it. That was the proof. The test was passed. This information, he concluded, had to be coming from a source, and I'm quoting him here, outside of her knowledge and control. And just like that, he was convinced.
Okay, so personal experiences, like the one Joseph Bates had, that's one thing. But as this little movement started to grow, they realized they needed something more. They needed a formal, theological defense to answer this growing chorus of critics.
And the main charge being thrown at them, it was a big one. Critics from both inside and outside the movement were saying that these new visions were basically becoming a second Bible, that they were replacing the Scripture as the final authority. And that struck right at the heart of their whole Bible alone identity.
Their solution to this was actually pretty elegant. They came up with what's now known as the lesser light principle, and Ellen White herself explained it this way. Her writings were not a new authority. Think of them instead as a lesser light, like a flashlight, whose only job is to point people to the greater light, which is the Bible. It wasn't a replacement. It was just a tool to help people see the Bible more clearly. And they used this kind of systematic thinking for all the other objections people threw at them. So when someone said, hey, you're making her visions a test of who can be in your church, they'd respond, nope, believing in the biblical doctrine of spiritual gifts is the test, not what any one person does with it. Or when her gender was brought up, a woman can't be a prophet. They just pointed right back to the Bible, to female prophets like Miriam and Deborah. Case closed.
So what happened after all this back and forth, all this defending? Well, the prophetic gift itself got elevated. It went from being just a helpful sign for a few scattered believers to becoming a core part of their identity. They started seeing it as an identifying mark that the Bible actually predicted would be a feature of God's true church at the end of time.
But, the challenges were far from over. Let's fast forward a bit to the 1880s, because now a whole new wave of more sophisticated attacks started coming, and it forced them to refine their beliefs even more.
And this next charge was maybe the most damaging of all: plagiarism. Critics, and the most famous one was a former Adventist minister named D.M. Canwright. They showed that Ellen White had used material from other authors in her own books, and she hadn't given them credit. For a lot of people, this looked really bad. It seemed to completely invalidate her claim of being divinely inspired.
So how do you even respond to something like that? Well, their answer was theological, and it was wrapped up in this really powerful metaphor. They said that the writers of the Bible, and by extension Ellen White, were God's pen men, not his pen. And that distinction, well, it's absolutely critical.
This is what led them to really spell out their doctrine of thought inspiration. Here's the idea. God doesn't dictate a message like a CEO dictating a memo, word for word. Instead, he inspires the person. He impresses thoughts and ideas onto their mind. And then that person expresses those divine thoughts using their own words, their own style, and even using historical facts or information they've researched. And just like that, this one single concept pretty neatly answered the whole plagiarism charge.
So when you step back and look at the whole story, it becomes really clear. This wasn't some belief that was just accepted overnight, not even close. It was an identity that was literally forged in the fires of debate and controversy over almost 50 years. This timeline here really puts it all in perspective, doesn't it? You can see the whole journey. It starts in the 1840s with this cautious, very practical, let's see if this works kind of acceptance. Then it moves into decades of defending the idea, then affirming it as a core belief, and finally refining it when faced with these really tough, complex challenges. It was a long road.
And I think that's the real takeaway. What started out as this comforting, practical sign for just a handful of spiritually shattered people, it evolved. Under all that pressure, it grew into a sophisticated, fundamental doctrine that today helps define a global church with millions of members. It was a process of evolution, not some sudden revolution.
And all of this leaves us with a much bigger question, one that goes way beyond just this one church. It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? How often are our own most deeply held beliefs, the things we think of as foundational, not something we just receive passively, but something that is actively forged, and maybe even made stronger in the very process of having to defend them against doubt?